This program is brought to you by PersonalLifeMedia.com. Living Dialogues is sponsored by Audible. Bestsellers in philosophy, spirituality, and self-help. Download your free audiobook from over 40,000 titles. Sign up for your risk-free trial at audiblepodcast.com/living. Join today. Cancel anytime in the first 2 weeks and keep your free book as your gift. You're going to love being an Audible listener.
From time immemorial, beginning with indigenous councils and ancient wisdom traditions, through the work of Western visionaries such as Plato, Galileo, and quantum physicist David Bohm, mutually participatory dialogue has been seen as the key to evolving and transforming consciousness, evoking a flow of meaning, a dia flow of logos, meaning, beyond what any one individual can bring through alone. So join us now, as together with you, the active deep listener, we evoke and engage in living dialogues.
Welcome to Living Dialogues. I'm your host, Duncan Campbell, and with me for this particular dialogue, I'm really delighted to have Duane Elgin. Duane Elgin is an author, speaker, evolutionary activist, and internet entrepreneur. He is the author of Voluntary Simplicity, Awakening Earth, and Promise Ahead, a vision of hope and action for humanity's future. Duane is a former senior social scientist at SRI International at Stanford University, where he co-authored numerous studies on the long-range future for the Environmental Protection Agency, the President's Science Advisor, and the National Science Foundation. He holds an MBA from the Wharton School and an MA in Economic History from the University of Pennsylvania. He lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. So, Duane, what a pleasure to have you on the program again.
Well, it's good to be here, Duncan. Thanks for having me.
One of the things I thought we might do in this particular program is to perhaps give an overview of your life and work, particularly perhaps beginning with when you first heard the call of what would become your life work, perhaps in boyhood. You know how Joe Campbell talks about how oftentimes in adolescence we first get a glimpse of the Grail, and then it's later in life that we find the full-blown mission. And so perhaps you could talk about your own life in that perspective.
Well, let's see. I grew up on a farm in Idaho, and my earliest recollections are of the connection with the earth, connection with animals, and my mother was a nurse, and so also and then a connection with healing. And I think those elements really weave together in my life, a feeling for nature, a feeling for the need for healing of humanity, and in different ways, those have woven into my life. And I did work after getting out of graduate school for 2 years back in Washington, D.C. on a presidential commission looking 30 years ahead at the American future. And for a farm boy from Idaho to be plopped down in the middle of a presidential commission looking at the deep future, that was an extraordinary education. And the biggest part of the education really was seeing that people weren't looking 30 years ahead. They weren't looking 10 years ahead. They were looking maybe only 1 or 2. And basically, I thought someone would be minding the store, and I discovered that they weren't. And so I left Washington, moved to California, began working at the Stanford Research Institute, and that's where, as you say, I ran into Joseph Campbell. And my first job there working at SRI really was working for a year looking at the deep archetypes, the deep stories, the deep images that we hold about ourselves as a human family. Are we builders? Are we warriors? Are we healers? And so on. And I remember this conversation I had with Joseph Campbell in 1972, 73. And I was asking him about well, what is the story that we have as a whole human family? Where are we going as a species? And he turned to me and he said, well, how should I know? He said, all of the stories I know about are tribal stories. They're stories about groupings, and they're not stories about the whole human family, and we have yet to discover that story, he said. And so that launched me on then what became, from, say, 1973, a 20-year process of inquiry and writing about, do we have a larger story? And indeed, I think we do, and that story is described in the book Awakening Earth that was finally published in 1993, 20 years after this conversation with Joseph Campbell. And in the interim before that, I wrote another book, Voluntary Simplicity, and I wrote that not because I had any expertise, but because I realized from my years of research that I had a lot to learn about living sustainably on this earth. And so I wrote that as much for myself as a learning experience as I did for anyone else. And that was then published in 1981. And lastly, the last book I published was in 2000, and that's the book Promise Ahead, which kind of summarizes all this work over the last 30-some years. And the last thing I would toss into the mix, kind of giving an overview of my life and the influences. In the 1980s, I spent that decade doing community organizing in the San Francisco Bay Area primarily on the whole theme of media accountability, and specifically television and broadcast television, and not only how it's really maybe polluting the collective mind with gratuitous sex and violence, but it's also there's an impoverishment of the collective mind by the absence of attention to things like climate change and species extinction. So another part of my life and work has been grassroots organizing for media accountability. So in addition to the writing, there's been that work as well. So that's kind of a quick overview of the last 30-some years.
Well, Duane, that's very elegantly stated, and I think one of the things that draws it all together is that passion that you had early on, as you described, even in your childhood, for the earth, a connectedness with a web of life and a feeling for the planet as a whole, as embodied in the earth, which is our home,
Yeah.
And then going to Washington, D.C., and in a sense being surprised to see that unlike the Native American heritage of this continent, people were not thinking 7 generations ahead. In fact, rarely are they thinking more than the next political election ahead or the next quarter on Wall Street.
Indeed, yeah.
And with that, your conversation with Joseph Campbell, I think, is very striking, because there was a similar interview with Joe Campbell that appeared in Paul Ray and Sherry Anderson's excellent book, The Cultural Creatives, in which Joe, for all of his great wisdom and knowledge, said that basically he had prepared the ground for a new vision to come through, but he was not the one to bring it through as such. And you have embarked on that great work, and